Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly massive topic, الإمبراطورية الفرنسية من ثلوج كندا إلى رمال إفريقيا. That's the French Empire, from the snows of Canada all the way to the sands of Africa. We're tracing the staggering geographic and historical footprint of one of the world's most transformative and, frankly, controversial powers. It's a journey from freezing, snow-covered trading posts straight into the scorching African deserts. So let's jump right in. Okay, let's dive into this, because the sheer contrast between these two major eras is absolutely fascinating. On one hand, you've got the First Empire in the Americas, running from the 16th to the 18th century. This was an empire built mostly on survival, chasing that lucrative fur trade and forming absolutely crucial alliances with native populations. But then, driven by an intense desire to recover their global glory after the Napoleonic Wars, France executed a massive pivot. The Second Empire, spanning the 19th and 20th centuries, wasn't about tiny trading posts anymore. No, this was about systemic land grabs across Africa, direct political rule, and extracting resources on a mind-boggling scale. Here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll go from snows to sands, looking at the First Empire's fur trade, the Second Empire's African incursion, the pillars of post-independence Françafrique, and finally, the modern decline of French influence. Starting right off with Section 1, the First Empire and the fur trade. France's early footprint in North America wasn't about planting massive, sprawling cities. It was all about satisfying Europe's incredibly profitable obsession with beaver pelts. Just look at the timeline here. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founds Quebec. Fast forward to 1670, and intense rivalries flare up as the British set up the Hudson's Bay Company. That sparks nearly a century of nonstop brutal military clashes. It all culminates in 1759 at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, which directly leads to the 1763 Treaty of Paris. And just like that, France essentially loses its North American empire. But you might be wondering, how did the French survive as long as they actually did in such a brutally harsh environment? Well, it boils down to furs for survival. See, unlike the British, who brought over massive populations to build agricultural settlements and push indigenous people off the land, the French demographic footprint was incredibly tiny. They set up these small trading outposts and literally had to rely on mutually beneficial trade networks with Native American populations. They trade European goods like knives, iron pots, and guns in exchange for beaver pelts. It was this deeply symbiotic economic relationship basically born entirely out of geographic necessity. Moving on to Section 2, the Second Empire and the African incursion. Having lost their North American foothold, France essentially turned its sights toward Africa. They needed to project power, extract resources, and, frankly, restore their global status. And the geographic expansion across the continent was absolutely staggering. We're talking about territory stretching all the way from the Mediterranean coast of Algeria, straight down through the Sahara, into West and Central Africa, plus Madagascar over in the Indian Ocean. Compared to those scattered, snowy trading posts in Canada, this was a completely different beast. To put the sheer scale of this into perspective, by 1936, the French African Empire encompassed over 10.4 million square kilometers. That is massive. You had over 43 million people living under French rule in territories like Algeria, French West Africa, and Madagascar. This wasn't just a haphazard land grab. It was a highly organized system specifically designed to supply mainland France with crucial raw materials, captive markets for their manufactured goods, and massive strategic military depth. Now, to actually manage this impossibly vast territory, France implemented these really rigid philosophies of direct rule and assimilation. It was a strict, systemic hierarchy. While the British often ruled indirectly through existing local structures, the French took a totally different approach. They sought to replace local cultures entirely. The idea was to technically make subjects French in language, culture, and administration. But in reality, this meant attempting to erase indigenous identities and centralizing all the real power directly in the hands of French colonial officials. Which brings us to Section 3, Françafrique, Pillars of Control. As we know, the era of formal colonialism eventually came to an end, and in the 1960s, a huge wave of independence swept across Africa. But, and this is key, France didn't just pack up and leave. Instead, the empire morphed into a deeply entrenched neo-colonial system widely known as Françafrique. Orchestrated largely by political figures like Jacques Foccart, this system rested on three main pillars. First up, economic, maintaining control through a shared currency called the CFA franc. Second, military,
keeping permanent military bases on the continent and signing secretive defense pacts. And third, cultural and political, using Francophone language initiatives and a dedicated African cell operating directly out of the French president's office in Paris.
So, the crucial point here is how this control actually manifested in everyday reality. Take the CFA franc, for example. Back in 1994, France made a sudden, completely unilateral decision to devalue the CFA franc by 50%, literally overnight. And they did this without consulting the African leaders whose entire economies relied on that currency. This single action halved the purchasing power of millions of Africans instantly, while conveniently making it much cheaper for French companies to operate and extract resources there. And this control was just as heavily enforced in the military sphere, 50 plus. That's the number of military interventions France executed in Africa between 1960 and 2008. Think about that for a second. If an allied African leader was threatened by a coup, French paratroopers would just swoop in to protect the regime. But if a leader went against French interests, well, Paris would conveniently look the other way, or sometimes even quietly support their removal. The military pillar was basically the ultimate enforcement mechanism for the whole system. And that leads us right into Section 4, the decline of French influence in the modern era. After decades of this deeply rooted, highly paternalistic system, we are currently watching a rapid and honestly dramatic unspooling of French power across the continent. Just look at the recent sequence of events in the Sahel region. Between 2021 and 2023, military juntas seized power in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Almost immediately, these new leaders completely dismantled old defense agreements, ordered French troops to withdraw, and expelled French ambassadors. And rather than returning to the Western fold, these nations are now actively seeking out new security and economic alliances with countries like Russia and Iran. It's a massive geopolitical shift. But you have to ask, why is this anti-French sentiment so incredibly potent right now? Well, it's not just about economics or military bases, it's heavily about dignity. Consider this 2007 quote from former French President Nicolas Sarkozy given in Dakar. He actually said, "The African man has not fully entered history." Lingering paternalistic attitudes exactly like this, combined with years of diplomatic missteps, have really fueled a powerful anti-French narrative. Today, local populations are actively rejecting what they view as a direct continuation of colonial-era arrogance. Which leaves us with a genuinely provocative question to think about. Are we witnessing the actual end of Françafrique? From the icy fur-trading rivers of Canada to the vast deserts of the Sahel, the French Empire has constantly adapted to survive over the centuries. But today, with new global powers stepping in and a fierce demand for genuine sovereignty from a totally new generation of Africans, this historic network of influence might finally be unraveling for good. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.